The bells of St. Bartholomew's have always struck me as faintly remorseful, as though each note regretted the one that came before. They rang that morning too, not for any ceremony or death that I knew of, but in that habitual way Oxford has of marking time as if it were confession. I'd woken late, which was no surprise. The night before had ended with a second whiskey too many, and a crossword clue that refused to yield sin concealed in sermon endlessly. I'd left it half done on my table, a small act of rebellion against certainty. Outside, the city was drenched in that spectral grey, peculiar to October. The cobblestones of Broad Street shimmered like fish scales beneath the mist. A porter nodded at me outside the Randolph, and, seeing my mood, thought better than to speak. I walked without purpose until my steps drew me past the gates of St. Bartholomew's College. The iron was slick with rain and the chapel doors slightly ajar. It was curiosity, not faith, that made me step inside. The air smelled of candle smoke and polish, the kind of scent that clings to places where people try too hard to believe. A single verger moved silently among the pews, collecting hymn books. From the pulpit, a draught stirred a sheaf of forgotten papers, sermons, perhaps, or the remnants of some student's confession. I thought, briefly, of the Dean Simon Carberry, scholar, reformer, sermonizer. I remembered him from years before, when I was invited to a college dinner, a man of intellect and unrelenting dignity, whose voice could make one feel both forgiven and accused in the same breath. Lewis would later tell me that the dean died that very morning, but at that moment I only sensed the emptiness of the chapel as something personal. I stood listening to the soft percussion of rain on stained glass, the faint wheeze of the organ pipes cooling, and thought that if there were a God, he had long since taken up residence in the margins of forgotten sermons. When the call came from headquarters, I was back in my flat, halfway through the crossword again. It was Stranger's voice on the line, clipped, uncertain, a death at St. Bartholomew's apparently natural. Yet there was that hesitation in his tone I knew too well, the kind that says, "Come look, even if you shouldn't need to." The dean's study was a tomb disguised as a scholarship. Bookshelves rose like solemn witnesses, their spines immaculate, their dust disturbed only by absence. A faint odor of spilt claret lingered. On the desk lay a stack of sermon drafts, one page half burnt in the fireplace. The fire itself had gone out hours earlier, but the edges of the paper still curled as if recoiling from something. Lewis pointed to a single phrase legible through the scorch marks. "To confess one's sins is to own another's burden." Lewis, dutiful as ever, was listing the facts. Time of death estimated around dawn, heart failure suggested, door locked from within. But my mind had already gone astray. A heart gives way for many reasons, and not all of them are physical. I glanced at the bookshelf and noticed a gap not wide but conspicuous to anyone who arranges books alphabetically by author, as Carberry always did. Between Donne and Eliot, a missing spine. Poetry, perhaps, or guilt. On the desk, beside the sermon papers, stood an overturned glass. A dark crescent of wine had dried on the blotter. I touched it cool, sticky. Odd for a man who had once made a public vow of abstinence. The smell of jasmine hung faintly in the air, misplaced and persistent, like an afterthought someone wished to erase. Lewis found the college bursar hovering at the door, eager to assert that the dean had been in excellent spirits. "Preparing his Sunday sermon even last night," the man said, voice bright with rehearsed sorrow. I asked about visitors. None that he knew of. Though after a pause, he recalled a woman, a lecturer from another college, seen leaving after Compline. Her name escaped him, as names often do when they matter. Back in the courtyard, the bells began again, slower now, each toll spreading across the damp stones like the echo of something not yet finished. Lewis looked up, uneasy. He asked if I believed the Dean had simply died of natural causes. I said that if Oxford had taught me anything, it was that very little here ever dies naturally. We left the college as dusk began to fold over the spires. The rain returned, softer this time, like an apology. At a traffic light, I found myself glancing at my crossword again, still unsolved. The clue stared up at me, silent but insistent. Sin concealed in sermon, endlessly. I tapped my pen against the steering wheel, the answer emerging like a whisper from the past, Morse. I laughed then, quietly and without joy. The bells were still ringing when we drove away. It was the sort of room that seemed to resent intrusion, the kind of place where even dust had learned discretion. Books pressed tightly against one another as if afraid of being opened, curtains drawn just enough to keep the morning from intruding too directly upon the accumulated silence. When I entered the Dean's study that afternoon, the air was still faintly warm, not with life, but with its echo. I've always distrusted rooms that appear too tidy after death. They rarely tell the truth. Lewis busied himself near the window, pretending not to notice that I had stopped by the hearth. Half a sermon lay among the ashes burnt from the edges inward, a perfect circle of destruction, leaving a single phrase untouched in the center. To confess one's sins is to own another's burden. The Dean's handwriting was unmistakable, the kind that made one believe in moral order, neat, deliberate, incapable of deceit. Yet there it was, curled in accusation. A glass had been knocked from the desk, its crimson stain dried into the grain of the oak. The scent of claret lingered faintly, but beneath it something else. Jasmine, sharp and uninvited. I have always trusted my nose more than my reason. The nose remembers where the mind prefers to forget. Lewis had found a torn letter among the Dean's papers, written in a woman's hand, though he couldn't tell me whose. It had been folded twice, then ripped clean through the middle, a gesture of both control and fury. "You mistake kindness for forgiveness," it said. They are not the same thing. The Dean, I thought, had known the difference long before he read those words. I sat at his desk and turned the pages of a sermon draft, lines of theology interspersed with hesitant personal notes, confessions masked as doctrine. One margin bore a small mark, a question written and crossed out again. It read simply, "Who hears the confessor?" I could almost see him pausing there, pen lifted, listening for an answer that never came. Outside, the quadrangle lay damp and quiet. A student crossed it carrying a 'cello case, the weight of youth and art both heavy on his shoulder. The world went on, as it always does. Lewis asked whether I thought the Dean had burned the paper himself. I told him perhaps, though the edges were too clean, the burn was too deliberate. He said the bursar mentioned in an anonymous letter accusations of moral hypocrisy, something about misused college funds. I nodded, though I doubted money had anything to do with this. Oxford's sins are rarely financial. They are far more refined. On the bookshelf behind the desk, I noticed a slim space between 2 volumes of Newman's sermons. A gap, narrow but deliberate. Something had been taken recently. The dust had been disturbed in a rectangle the width of a small notebook. Lewis missed it, but I didn't mention it. Some details prefer to be left to solitude until they're ready to speak. When I looked again at the desk, I found a blotting pad. The ink had dried in soft concentric stains, but beneath it barely visible the outline of a sentence pressed into the paper below. I shaded over it lightly with my pencil. The words emerged faintly. "Forgive me, Eleanor." The name meant nothing to Lewis, and I told him as much, though it lingered unpleasantly in the back of my mind. The bursar returned then, red-faced and rehearsed, offering the kind of pious sorrow Oxford keeps in reserve for respectable tragedies. He spoke of the Dean's recent fatigue, his noble resistance to gossip, his plans for a sermon he would now never finish. I let him talk. Words, after all, are the safest form of concealment. When he left, I turned again toward the fireplace. The ashes were grey, fine as talcum, yet one corner of the paper remained unburned, a fragment of handwriting too small for Lewis to have noticed. I read it only once. This truth must end with me. We left as the afternoon light began to wither. In the corridor, a small draught stirred the college flags, and I thought of that phrase again, to own another's burden. Oxford was full of people doing precisely that, though not for love or duty, but for the exquisite comfort of guilt. Later, in the pub, Lewis wondered aloud why the dean would have been writing sermons so late if he was unwell. I said that some men only find the courage to speak to God when they've already been heard by the devil. He didn't reply. I finished my pint in silence, thinking of the missing book, the scent of jasmine, the name Eleanor, and the dean, alone in that room, interrupted in thought but not in consequence. Funerals in Oxford are rarely occasions of raw grief. They are more often performances of civility rituals of tone and restraint. The dean's was no exception. The rain, punctual as ever, fell in thin, forgiving threads. I remember thinking it suited the mood of the congregation, neither repentant nor relieved, merely inconvenienced. We gathered beneath the stone vaults of St. Bartholomew's Chapel, where the air smelled of damp hymnals and unspoken rivalry. Lewis stood near the door, solemn but ill at ease, as though afraid of disturbing a hierarchy, even in death. I took a seat toward the back, where the view allowed for both observation and anonymity. From there, I could see the three whose faces revealed what their words would later deny. The first was Dr. Alice Hargreaves, austere in a black suit that seemed to absorb the candlelight. Her hands were clasped too tightly, the knuckles pale as parchment. A theologian of precision and principle, she had been the dean's most public adversary, yet her posture spoke of loss, not triumph. When the choir began Abide With Me, she did not sing. Grief, I've found, often hides in refusal. Beside her sat Michael Fenn, the young chaplain, the sort of man who smiles when he believes God is watching. His lips moved with the hymns, but no sound emerged. I'd heard whispers of his ambition, his sermons more theatrical than doctrinal. There was a gleam of something in his admiration, perhaps envy that lingers when devotion meets opportunity. And then, behind them, half shadowed by a pillar, was Eleanor Vane. I had not expected her to attend. She wore a dark veil, though it seemed less for mourning than for concealment. The tilt of her head betrayed an alertness the way one listens when words are meant for someone else. She met my gaze once, only briefly, but in that glance I sensed history, not scandal precisely, but the kind of intimacy that Oxford prefers to call understanding. The service droned on, its cadences ancient and exhausted. The college choir, all adolescent sincerity, sang without conviction. Yet when the dean's name was read aloud, I felt a flicker of something close to tenderness. He had been, for all his faults, a man who believed in order, moral, theological, linguistic. And now he had left behind a chaos no sermon could tidy. Afterwards, in the cloister, the mourners dispersed in gentle waves of condolence. Lewis collected statements with the dutiful patience of a man accustomed to other people's evasions. I lingered near the rain-slicked archway, listening to the voices. Hargreaves's tone was clipped, almost academic. She remarked that death came too easily to those who avoided self-doubt. Fenn, hovering near the bursar, murmured something about Providence, though his eyes kept drifting toward Eleanor. She, in turn, spoke to no one. Her silence drew more attention than speech could have managed. It was there, beneath the dripping stone, that I noticed a small thing, the chaplain's fingers stained faintly with wax. He had handled the altar candles that morning, perhaps, yet the mark seemed too fresh, too deliberate. I made no remark. Deduction, like guilt, ripens best in solitude. Lewis joined me, his coat collar turned up. He asked if I believed the dean's death to be connected to the woman in the veil. I told him Oxford is a city of veils, some made of lace, others of Latin. He took that as avoidance, which it was. We spoke briefly with Hargreaves before she left. Her condolences were phrased like a thesis, defense-controlled, impersonal, irrefutable. When I mentioned the unfinished sermon found in the dean's study, her expression tightened, a twitch so minute it might have been imagined. She said he had been writing on the subject of confession, that he intended to deliver it the following Sunday. A sermon on confession from a man accused of hypocrisy. I could almost hear the irony humming between her words. Eleanor Vane departed alone, slipping through the gate that led toward Magdalene Lane. The veil fluttered briefly in the wind before she disappeared. I remember thinking that she moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to being followed. When the bells began again, echoing across the wet courtyard, the mourners paused instinctively as if the sound carried an instruction none could yet decipher. I felt that same pause within myself. The rain had blurred the inscriptions on the gravestones, making all names briefly anonymous. I wondered if that was mercy or indifference. Lewis asked what I had learned. "Only that grief, like guilt, has accents," I said. 3 of them today. And each spoke a different truth. By the time we returned to the dean's study that Thursday afternoon, the scent of jasmine had faded. The claret stain had darkened into something almost ecclesiastical, as though it too sought absolution. I remember sitting at his desk again, leafing through the sermon drafts, and finding myself irritated by the precision of his handwriting, the deliberate loops, the careful punctuation. Even the margins looked virtuous. Lewis was talking to the college secretary, a thin woman whose eyes betrayed the loyalty of long service. She insisted the dean had been in fine spirits the day before his death and had spoken at length about St. Augustine. I asked her what precisely he had said. She frowned, searching memory, then repeated a line that made me look up. "The heart is restless until it condemns." It was wrong, of course. Augustine had written until it rests. Condemns rest. A single word changed, and yet the meaning inverted completely. That misquotation lingered with me. It wasn't the sort of slip a theologian like Carberry would make. I asked Lewis to check the carbon copies of the dean's previous sermons. Everyone was faultlessly cited, each reference pristine. But this one sermon he never finished bore corruption at its center. Someone had touched it, or him. I went to the college library after that, more to think than to search. The rain had returned, soft and constant, drumming on the glass dome above the reading room. A few students worked in silence, the kind that feels almost liturgical. Among them I saw Michael Fenn, the chaplain. He was copying notes from a theological index, his pen moving with the nervous precision of a man rehearsing virtue. When I greeted him, he looked up too quickly. He spoke warmly of the dean, of his generosity, his faith, his quiet authority. But beneath the words, there was a tremor, a brief faltering when I mentioned the sermon on confession. He said he had heard parts of it once, that the dean had read it aloud in draft. Then he paused, corrected himself, and said perhaps he was mistaken. I asked whether the dean had ever misquoted Augustine. His smile faltered again. "Perhaps never intentionally," he murmured. I left him there, his fingers tapping the edge of the book as though keeping rhythm with a memory best left unplayed. Back at the college, Lewis was waiting with news. The bursar had turned over a small folder labeled Private Correspondence Theological Society. Inside were letters exchanged between the dean and Dr. Alice Hargreaves, written in the cold civility of academic dissent. She accused him of diluting doctrine with sentimentality. He replied with elegant patience. Yet in the final letter, his tone shifted. "You mistake mercy for weakness." I could almost hear her voice answering that accusation in the chapel pews. A gust of wind pushed through the open window, scattering a few sermon pages across the floor. One landed face down at my feet, its margin marked with a faint impression, not ink, but the trace of something pressed hard into the paper. I shaded it gently with a pencil. Beneath the texture emerged a single phrase. Forgive the author, not the text. It felt more like a plea than a note. That night I dreamt of the dean. He was standing in the pulpit, reciting a line over and over, though I could never quite catch it. When I woke, the phrase returned to me. The heart is restless until it condemns. The deliberate error, the wrong word used with purpose. Someone had replaced the language of peace with the language of guilt, and guilt, as I knew too well, was rarely grammatical. The next morning I asked Lewis to check the dean's typewriter. It sat on a side table, neat as an altar. One ribbon, recently replaced. A test sheet beside it. I typed the word condemns myself, then rested. The imprint of the R was faint, the metal arm slightly misaligned. It would have left a telltale gap except in the sermon draft. The word condemns was printed cleanly. That meant the sentence had not been typed by the dean at all. Someone else had completed it. When I told Lewis, he frowned, uncertain of its meaning. To me, it was nothing short of revelation, though not the kind found in Scripture. Someone had altered the dean's sermon, reshaping it with a single word. The moral turned inward, the mercy turned cruel. And somewhere between those two meanings, a life had ended. Outside, the chapel bell began again, patient as conscience. I stood by the window, watching the rain thicken against the panes, and thought of how easily faith becomes forgery and how rarely either can be proved. Magdalene Lane lies just off the high street, narrow enough that 2 umbrellas can barely pass without apology. It smells perpetually of rain and jasmine, the latter escaping from the garden of a small guest house called the King's Arms, where Eleanor Vane had stayed the night before the dean's death. I remember standing beneath its eaves, the rain gathering along the brim of my hat, while Lewis checked the visitor ledger with the awkward deference of a man who dislikes inquiring after the dead. She had signed in under a false name, though not cleverly, Helen Vaughan, a choice that made me smile without joy. The Great Godpan had been one of those books Oxford prefers to condemn quietly while never ceasing to read. Such literary disguises are a form of confession, even if their author doesn't know it. The landlady described her as polite, quiet, and troubled. She had eaten alone, ordered a single glass of red wine, and asked for her bill to be ready at dawn. No visitors, the woman insisted, though her hesitation betrayed uncertainty. I asked if the guest had left anything behind. A pause. Then the landlady produced a small paper bag containing a handkerchief embroidered with the initials E.V. and a faint trace of scent I had already begun to associate with death. We found her later that afternoon in her rooms on the edge of Jericho. The curtains were half drawn, muting the winter light, and the faint sound of a wireless played something baroque and inconsolable. She stood by the window, her profile sharp, her composure almost theatrical. I introduced myself. She said she had expected this call eventually. Her voice was calm, low, almost amused. She spoke of the dean as one might speak of a city once loved and now left behind. He had been kind, she said, in that particular Oxford way, kindness seasoned with distance. They had known each other years before, when her husband was alive. He had been a lecturer then, dismissed quietly after an accusation of plagiarism that the dean had never retracted. Her husband drank himself into silence soon after. Her visit, she said, had not been about revenge. Only the truth. Lewis asked if she had seen the dean before his death. She denied it with a grace that invited belief. Yet on her writing table lay a copy of Confessions of St. Augustine. Its spine increased, but the inside cover tore where an inscription had been removed. A faint square of discoloration marked the absence of a book plate. I said nothing then, only noted the torn page and the scent of jasmine that lingered despite the cold. As we left, I noticed a letter resting atop her piano. It was addressed in a careful, masculine hand to Mrs. E. Vane Personal. The seal had been broken, the paper folded twice, as though reread many times. When she saw me glance toward it, she smiled, not in embarrassment, but in challenge. "Some things, Inspector, must remain unread," she said. I didn't argue. We both understood the comfort of secrets kept intact. Back on the street, the sky had surrendered to a pale drizzle. Lewis remarked that she didn't seem the vengeful type. I told him that vengeance is rarely loud in Oxford. It whispers through letters, sermons, and the deliberate choice of a pseudonym. He asked what I made of the book. I said that no one keeps a gift from a dead man unless they wish to feel his absence twice. That evening, I returned to my flat and took out the Dean's sermon drafts once more. The scent of jasmine clung faintly even to those pages now. I read again the line half burnt in the grate. To confess one's sins is to own another's burden. I thought of Eleanor Vane's composure, her precision, her refusal to deny what was not asked. It occurred to me that her burden might not have been guilt, but forgiveness withheld. Later, as I poured a whiskey, a thought arrived quietly, inevitably. The missing book from the Dean's shelf, a volume once gifted to a colleague, a torn inscription. Oxford's sins, it seemed, were always written in the margins. It was nearly midnight when we found him in the chapel of Michael Fenn, the chaplain, standing in the pulpit beneath the faint glow of the sanctuary lamp. His voice carried softly through the nave, not preaching exactly, but rehearsing. The words rose and fell like waves retreating across stones, fragments of scripture mingling with phrases that felt too personal for liturgy. Lewis and I had entered quietly, though it seemed he had been expecting us. He stopped speaking only when the echo of his own voice betrayed his solitude. His expression was one of those studied pieties the devout sometimes wear, halfway between humility and self-love. He said he couldn't sleep, that sermons wrote themselves better in the dark. I told him I'd always thought confession did too. He smiled at that, as if he recognized the provocation and chose not to answer it. The chapel was cold, the kind of cold that smells of stone and beeswax. A single candle flickered on the lectern beside an open Bible. Beneath it lay a sheet of paper, freshly typed. The first line reads, "Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be understood." It was not a verse I recognized, nor, I suspected, had it ever been written in any gospel. I asked him about the Dean. He bowed his head, too readily. He said the Dean had been a mentor, a father figure, an imperfect saint. There was a pause that followed a word used too earnestly. Then he added that the Dean had confided in him during his final week, troubled by some matter of conscience. A woman, perhaps. I said nothing. Some truths prefer silence as witness. Lewis, dutifully efficient, asked about the tape cassette we'd found in the Dean's drawer, labeled Fenn. Confession. Fenn's eyes flickered, a movement so brief it could have been prayer. He said it was part of a series of pastoral reflections, recorded at the Dean's request. His tone made it sound almost administrative. I told him I'd listen to it. He asked, too quickly, what I'd heard. I said only a man was weeping. He looked away then, toward the altar where the candlelight trembled against the brass cross. He said the Dean wept often in those last months, though never for himself. I doubted that. I have known a few men who could mourn others without first mourning their own failures. As we turned to leave, I noticed something peculiar on the sermon sheet. The typeface was identical to the Dean's machine, but the ribbon had left a faint shadow around each letter, a ghost image of an earlier text, overwritten but not entirely gone. I bent closer and caught the outline of another line beneath the present one. "Blessed are they who lie, for they shall be forgiven." The change was subtle, but deliberate. Words recast, faith repurposed. The dean had not written that version, or, if he had meant to bury it. Outside, the quadrangle was slick with rain. Lewis asked if I thought the chaplain was lying. I said that honesty and confession were not synonyms. He didn't press me further. He was learning. Later, back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and played the cassette again. The voice that emerged was neither the dean's nor the chaplain's, but something in between, a tremor of dependence, of reverence blurred by guilt. I caught a phrase, almost swallowed by static. She came to me first. I rewound it 3 times, uncertain whether I had heard it at all. I thought of Eleanor Vane, her poised composure, the faint smell of jasmine that seemed to follow me even now. And I thought of the dean, alone in that study, surrounded by sermons he no longer believed. Perhaps she had come to the chaplain. Perhaps she had gone to the dean. Perhaps both had tried to save her, and in doing so condemned themselves. The rain had ceased by the time I turned off the recorder. The city outside was drenched in the hush that follows confession, not forgiveness, exactly, but exhaustion. I sat there for a long time, the taste of whiskey dry on my tongue, thinking how faith and deceit often kneel at the same altar. It was Lewis who found the note, or rather, stumbled upon it, while trying to make sense of the dean's marginalia. He had been cataloguing the sermon drafts in order, one by one, as methodical as a librarian and twice as patient. I watched from across the room, idly tracing the rim of my glass with a pencil. His voice, when it came, was uncertain. "There's something written here, sir." "Greek, I think." "Greek," I said. That would be Carberry. He never believed a point properly made until it had survived translation. I took the page from him. The ink was faint, written in the dean's cramped hand between 2 lines of theology, kai ta aphron. It took a moment for memory to catch up with comprehension of a phrase from Corinthians, and the foolish things. The words meant little in isolation, yet in the dean's hand they felt deliberate. I told Lewis it might have been a sermon note. He nodded, unpersuaded, and went back to arranging papers into neat, hopeless symmetry. But the phrase lingered with me. The foolish things. The verse continues that God hath chosen to confound the wise. I thought of the dean, surrounded by intellect, felled not by ignorance, but by something far more intimate. I spent the afternoon in the college library, hoping proximity to dust might yield clarity. The rain had returned in its gentlest form, turning the stained glass into slow-moving color. The librarian, a woman of advanced patience, led me to a locked cabinet containing the dean's private collection. She spoke of him with the reverence usually reserved for saints or benefactors. He had been translating a set of diaries, she said, from 1912. Anonymous, but almost certainly the work of a young don who had taken his own life. The dean had been obsessed with them in his final weeks. The translation stopped abruptly midway through a passage about guilt and silence. I turned the brittle pages myself. The Greek was immaculate, the handwriting young and self-conscious. Yet in the margin of the final entry, written in the dean's hand, were 2 English words, "Forgive Alice." Lewis, who had joined me by then, asked if it might refer to Dr. Hargreaves. I said perhaps, though it was a dangerous thing to assume forgiveness always seeks the living. Still, the coincidence was unavoidable. The dean and Hargreaves had once co-authored a paper on St. Paul that has something to do with moral paradox and divine folly. Kai ta aphron, the foolish things. I began to suspect that the footnote was no mere scholarly aside, but a key to the dean's final message. When we left the library, the bells were ringing for evensong. Oxford in that hour always feels half-remembered, as though it exists chiefly for its own echo. Lewis suggested a pint, but I preferred to walk. The evening air carried the faintest trace of jasmine again. It seemed to follow me through the narrow lanes like a promise unkept. By the time I reached the chapel, the service was ending. The choir boys' voices dissolved into silence as the verger extinguished the candles. On the lectern, beside a row of hymnals, I noticed a scrap of paper folded twice. It was a translation exercise by the Deans, unmistakably. On one side, the Greek phrase I'd seen earlier, on the other, his own rendering, "The foolish things endure because they love." I stood there longer than was sensible. Love, endurance, folly, Oxford's trinity of ruin. Lewis arrived moments later, surprised to find me still staring at the paper. He asked what I saw. I said a confession disguised as scholarship. We walked back through the cloister in silence. Somewhere behind us, a door closed softly, and the sound seemed to settle like dust in the air. Lewis said he couldn't see how a line of Greek could have anything to do with murder. I told him that in Oxford, theology is often the language people use when they mean something else entirely. That night I placed the phrase "kai ta aphron" in my notebook, beneath a crossword clue from the morning paper, "What fools cherish, the wise abandon." The answer, I realized after a moment, was truth. It was Lewis who found him first, the verger's son, a boy of 16 with a vague self-consciousness of youth and the uncertain bravery that comes from being listened to by policemen. We sat with him in the vestry while he fidgeted with his choir collar, his voice hesitant as though each word might betray him to the stone saints that stared down from the walls. He said he had seen a light burning in the dean's office after midnight, the sort of detail one remembers because it doesn't belong. He'd been returning from practice for the founder's service, he said, when he noticed the study door slightly open. He'd thought it strange that the dean, who was so precise about ritual, would leave anything unfinished at that hour. And then he saw someone leaving by the cloister, a figure in a scholar's gown, the hem brushing the flagstones, moving with purpose but without hurry. Not the dean, he was certain of that. Taller, heavier perhaps. The gown had caught the edge of the candlelight and glimmered for a second before vanishing into the darkness. Lewis, ever the gentle interrogator, asked whether he could recognize the figure. The boy hesitated. He thought it might have been a woman whose walk was too measured, the posture too graceful for a man. I watched him as he said it. His voice did not waver, but his hands trembled slightly. Fear, not of us, but of what he might have seen. Oxford has a way of teaching its witnesses to doubt themselves. When we left the chapel, the rain had settled into a steady, intimate rhythm. The cloister glistened faintly, the ancient stones reflecting the flicker of the sanctuary lamp. I stood where the boy had seen the figure. From that vantage, one could move unseen toward either the library or the gardens beyond. The path was narrow but direct, and even now the faintest impression of footprints remained in the moss between stones blurred, indecisive but not erased. Lewis suggested we question Dr. Hargreaves again. Her rooms overlooked that same cloister, and she was known to work late. I agreed. There was something about the way she had spoken at the funeral, the deliberate stillness of her words, that suggested a mind accustomed to calculation. Her study was a fortress of order. Books arranged by century, glass cabinets of ecclesiastical texts, and a faint trace of burned paper. She greeted us with the composure of one who believes in her own innocence. I remarked that she must find the nights lonely without the dean's theological sparring. She replied that loneliness is a luxury scholars seldom afford themselves. Her tone was dry, controlled, but the hand that rested on the arm of her chair betrayed a flicker of unease when I mentioned the Greek phrase from the dean's notes. She said it was from Corinthians, of course. The foolish things, she translated, that confound the wise. I asked if the dean had ever discussed that passage with her. She paused, long enough for silence to become implication, and said he had often, in fact. It had been their last argument. He believed folly could be redemptive. She did not. She preferred truth, however cruel. When we left, Lewis asked what I thought. I said truth and cruelty are often the same when uttered by clever people. Then, as we walked through the quad, something occurred to me, not a revelation, but a quiet adjustment of focus. The boy's description of the figure taller, heavier perhaps, in a gown. Hargreaves was tall for a woman, her gait deliberate, almost ceremonial, and yet the scent that clung to her study was not jasmine, but smoke. Back at the office, I took out the dean's blotting pad again. Beneath the faint marks of ink and sermon lines, I noticed a deeper impression of a sentence written and pressed hard into the paper, though the ink never took. I shaded gently across it. The words appeared like a whisper pulled from silence. She came at midnight. The choir boy's testimony had been true then, though not in the way he understood it. Someone had indeed come that night, bearing both learning and grief, dressed in the costume of sanctity, but whether she had entered for love, confession, or correction, that remained uncertain. Lewis knocked softly, breaking my thoughts. He said he'd spoken again to the verger's son, who remembered something new. A sound, faint and discordant, like a hymn played wrong. The organ pipes, perhaps, settling with the cold, or a human breath mistaken for one. I told him to make a note of it anyway. In Oxford, even mistakes are deliberate. When I left the station, the air was thick with mist. The bells began their slow toll, and I thought again of the Dean, of Hargreaves, of Eleanor Vane. Each had sought a kind of absolution, and each in turn had mistaken intellect for faith. The foolish things indeed. The envelope was wedged behind a hymn book, the sort of place a man hides something when he wants it found by accident. I discovered it in the Dean's study on a Sunday morning, the air still thick with the scent of extinguished candles. Lewis had been fussing with the window latch, muttering about drafts, when my hand brushed against the stiff spine of the hymnal, and the letter slipped free. It was unsealed, addressed to Eleanor Vane, and written in the Dean's precise, patient script. The first line arrested me. "My dear Eleanor, I've carried your silence longer than my own sins." It wasn't a love letter, not quite. Too controlled for that, too measured. Yet beneath every sentence there was the steady pulse of a man who had tried, too late, to unmake what he had done. He confessed obliquely, of course, to a false accusation years earlier, one that had destroyed another's reputation, a colleague, a husband, her husband. He spoke of envy disguised as righteousness, of punishment he had justified as moral duty, and now, at last, remorse had found its tongue. The final line read simply, "I hope to speak the rest on Sunday, if my courage permits," but Sunday never came. Lewis, who had read over my shoulder, asked if we should take it as motive. I said it was more dangerous than that. Guilt breeds many things: confession, destruction, even tenderness. Motive is too small a word for what drives the devout. He frowned, unsure if I was mocking theology or defending it. We took the letter to the college secretary. She confirmed that Eleanor Vane had been expected for evensong the evening before the Dean's death, though she never arrived. A telegram, she said, had been delivered to the Dean that afternoon. It was missing from his desk now. The secretary remembered only one phrase from it. "I cannot bear the past to speak again." The phrasing lingered with me. To speak again, not to repeat, but to resurrect. It had the sound of something written by a scholar, or a woman too used to precision. I asked Lewis to check the telegraph records. He returned hours later, his shoes still wet from the drizzle, with a thin slip of paper confirming the sender, E. Vane. That evening I walked alone through the cloisters. The lamps cast thin halos on the wet stones, and the air trembled faintly with the sound of distant choir practice. The hymn was one I hadn't heard in years. "Lead, kindly light." I thought of the Dean's words, "To confess one's sins is to own another's burden." Perhaps that was his mistake, assuming Eleanor still wanted hers returned. In the college archive, I reread the Dean's sermon drafts, looking for what he had intended to say that Sunday. Halfway through the final page, the ink faltered, a line began and was abandoned. To name one's wrong is to invite, and then nothing. The pen had lifted mid-sentence, as though something or someone had entered the room. I ran my fingers across the indentation, and beneath the faint script felt another mark, barely visible forgiveness withheld. The words were written not in ink, but pressed into the paper, as if carved by the weight of hesitation. Lewis joined me, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed against the chill. He asked whether I thought she'd killed him. I said that killing and forgiving are sometimes the same act performed at different speeds. He looked troubled by that. I didn't blame him. Later, in the chapel, I found Eleanor seated alone, her hands folded like parentheses around a silence she refused to break. I asked if she had come to pray. She said no, to listen. I told her we had found the letter. Her expression didn't change. She said she had written her reply to the telegram, but hadn't expected him to obey it so literally. There was no triumph in her voice, only weariness. When she left, I noticed she placed a small envelope on the altar. The verger, sweeping after evensong, handed it to me without ceremony. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing 3 words. He was forgiven. I didn't show it to Lewis. That night, back in my flat, I placed both letters side by side, the Dean's unsent confession and her belated pardon. Between them lay a gulf that neither theology nor justice could bridge. I poured a whiskey, turned off the lamp, and thought of the sermon he never gave, that small, unfinished sentence ending with a dash, an absence, an open mouth. Perhaps, I thought, that was the truest confession of all. I returned to the chapel on a night thick with rain, the kind of rain that settles on the skin like regret. St. Bartholomew loomed in its familiar silhouette, part sanctuary, part tomb. The candles had long burned out, but a faint shimmer of wax clung to the brass holders, like a memory refusing to fade. I carried the Dean's final sermon pages with me, the ink smudged from too many readings, the words brittle from too much scrutiny. The last word on the final sheet was mercy. It had been underlined once, then crossed out with a single, decisive stroke. Beneath it, barely visible under the lamplight, the indentation of another word pressed into the page. I shaded lightly with a pencil until the shape revealed itself. There are words that seem to change temperature as one reads them. Forgiveness was one. It carried heat and cold in equal measure, absolution for some, condemnation for others. I thought of the Dean, alone in that room, the sermon unfinished, the air thick with jasmine and despair. Lewis arrived quietly, his footsteps respectful against the stone floor. He asked if I'd found what I was looking for. I told him that I had found too much. I showed him the page. He squinted, puzzled, then said it looked like a correction. I said no, not a correction. Confession. We walked together to the Dean's study one last time. The fire grate had been cleaned, but the scent of burnt paper still lingered faintly beneath the polish. I stared at the desk, the inkpot, the half-empty glass, the neat arrangement of pens, and wondered how long he had sat there before deciding which word would be his last. Lewis reminded me of the forensic report traces of digitalis found in the claret. Enough to kill, though slowly. I asked who else would have known he still kept wine in his study. Lewis said only those close to him, Hargreaves perhaps, or the chaplain. I nodded. Both had proximity, both had motive, though neither had peace. When we questioned Hargreaves again, her defiance had wilted into weariness. She said that truth, like faith, was best left unspoken once it ceased to comfort. She admitted she had known of the dean's confession and his intention to reveal her role in the long-forgotten scandal. But she claimed she had gone to his study only to dissuade him, not to harm him. She had brought him a small gift, she said, a bottle of vintage claret. The irony was almost poetic. I asked whether she had seen him drink from it. She closed her eyes briefly, as though recalling the last note of a hymn. "He poured for both of us," she whispered, but only one glass was emptied. Lewis later would call it an admission. I wasn't sure. In Oxford, guilt has a talent for sounding like philosophy. Still, when we left her room, I noticed a faint tremor in her hands. On her desk, beside a pile of marked essays, lay a sprig of jasmine pressed between the pages of a hymnal. I said nothing. Some proofs are too cruel to articulate. Back in the chapel, I read the sermon aloud, quietly, to the empty pews. It was about confession, about the mercy that demands no witness. The cadence was steady, the theology sound. Only near the end did it falter. To confess one's sins is to own another's burden. I thought of Eleanor Vane, her composure, her silence, of Fenn, his hollow faith, of Hargreaves, brittle with pride, and of the Dean, who had carried all their sins as if they were his own. Perhaps that was his folly, or his faith. When the bells began their slow toll for midnight, I replaced the sermon on the pulpit. Rain streaked the stained glass, distorting the saints into something almost human. Lewis asked if we should file the case as resolved. I said we might, though I doubted it ever would be. He looked puzzled. I told him that every confession, once spoken, changes the listener as much as the speaker. The Dean's death was not a punishment, but an exchange the last sermon preached to no one but himself. As we left, I paused by the doorway. The air smelled faintly of jasmine once more. Perhaps it was the residue of memory, or perhaps it lingered because someone had returned, not in guilt, but in grief. Outside, the rain eased into silence. I lit a cigarette, watched the smoke curl into the damp air, and thought again of that single word pressed into paper, forgive. A strange thing, forgiveness. It ends nothing, but it changes the sound of the rain. The case was over, or so they told me. The files were closed, statements typed, motives arranged into sentences that made bureaucratic sense. But even now, when the bells of St. Bartholomew's drift faintly across the evening air, I can still hear the Dean's voice not as sermon, but as echo. Oxford had returned to its customary composure. The porters resumed their gossip, the dons their disputations, and the chapel its careful routine of hymns and half-belief. Lewis, cheerful as ever, said that closure was a rare luxury in our line of work. He meant it kindly. Yet there was something in that word closure that felt at odds with the city itself. Oxford never closes. It pauses, rearranges, forgets by remembering differently. I went back once more to the Dean's study. The rain had left the window panes blurred, turning the gardens beyond into a wash of grey. The fire grate was cold, its ashes finally swept away. On the desk, where the blotter once bore traces of confession, lay only the brass inkwell and a folded handkerchief monogrammed with his initials. A detail so ordinary it felt like punctuation. Lewis joined me briefly, carrying 2 cups of tea he didn't really want. He said the coroner's verdict had been accepted suicide under emotional distress. He hesitated before adding that Hargreaves had resigned from her lectureship. Eleanor Vane, meanwhile, had left Oxford quietly, a note to the bursar expressing gratitude for the Dean's understanding. I asked if she had meant forgiveness. He said perhaps it was the same thing. When he left, the silence returned not hostile, merely expectant. I opened the Dean's final sermon again. Its pages had yellowed slightly, as though aging were an act of sympathy. The text was structured with academic precision, each paragraph leading neatly toward an absent conclusion. The last written line reads, To confess one's sins is to own another's burden. Then nothing, only the faintest indentation where the next sentence might have begun. For a while I sat there, imagining the rest of it. Perhaps he would have spoken of grace, of release, of the kind of peace that requires no audience. Or perhaps he would have faltered as he did in life, between faith and intellect, between mercy and truth. I will never know. But I like to think that even unfinished, his sermon said more than most ever complete. There was a small, inconspicuous drawer beneath the desk that I hadn't noticed before. Inside, I found a crossword torn neatly from the Times. The clues were partly filled in, his handwriting steady but hurried. One word, I saw, had been circled twice: atonement. I smiled, though not with satisfaction. The answer he had written beside it was wrong by one letter. I left the college as the first chime of evensong began. The rain had stopped, leaving the air polished, tender. A group of students passed me in the quad, laughing in the careless way the young do before they learn that laughter, too, can haunt. Beyond them, the chapel doors stood open, and I glimpsed the flicker of candlelight inside. For a moment, I thought I heard the dean's voice again, not from the pulpit, but from somewhere nearer, quieter. Perhaps memory, perhaps imagination. He was speaking the final word of his sermon, the word he had once crossed out: mercy. Lewis caught up with me at the Sai gate, asked if I was all right. I told him I was thinking. He said I thought too much. I told him that thinking was simply another form of praying, and he laughed, the sound chasing itself into the fog. When he left, I lingered alone by the chapel steps. The wet stones gleamed faintly, reflecting a sky already losing its light. Somewhere a choir boy's voice carried the last line of a hymn, something about peace and the journey's end. I almost envied the certainty in it. I turned back once more toward the empty pulpit. There was no sermon now, no congregation, no absolution, only the lingering scent of wax and paper and the memory of words that had tried and failed to reach grace. I thought, not for the first time, that perhaps all sermons are unfinished, even the ones we live by. The bells began again, patient and unhurried. I stood listening until the final chime dissolved into the evening, then walked away, the sound fading like an unanswered prayer.